Welcome back to episode 12 of the Lantern Sports Podcast, hosted by the Lantern Sports Desk here at The Ohio State University. I'm Stephen Kishpaugh, Assistant Sports Editor to the Lantern, and joining me as always, to my right, we have Assistant LTV Sports Producer Gabe Burggraf. Across from me, as always, we have Sports Editor Jacob Benge, and then to my left, we have LTV Sports Producer Casey Smith. So, gentlemen, we missed last week, so we have a lot to talk about. But normally here is where I do the athletic recap, but, we had some breaking news last night that, we just wanted to address real quick. Jagger Joshua, a member of the Michigan State men's ice hockey team, accused an Ohio State men's ice hockey player of calling him a racial slur, either multiple times or multiple racial slurs. We don't have too much information, but Jacob, you wrote the story on that. Can you just provide any clarity as to what we know right now?
Yeah, Stephen. So it sounds like the gist of the entire story is that, as you mentioned, Jagger Joshua was called multiple racial slurs by a member of the Ohio State men's ice hockey team in a game in East St. Lansing, November 11th. And so Ohio State put out a statement in response, and after the fact, once Joshua had tweeted that out. But the Big Ten also put out a statement, supposedly, that there was an investigation done collaboratively with the Big Ten and Ohio State. And they reached a resolution that we're still seeking some more clarification on, following up on that. So, we put that story out on Monday.
Yeah, and the Lantern will be able to, provide more information as it comes out with, just everything. Surrounding this is a very serious topic, and we want to make sure that we report it as fairly and as accurately as we can. So, as more information comes out, we will do our best to report on it. All right, and so, aside from, this week being probably the biggest week in Columbus in quite some time, we have the privilege this weekend to experience the game between Ohio State and Michigan in Ohio Stadium. For the first time since I think any of us have entered college. We all came in, I believe, class of 2019. The game hasn't been played in Ohio Stadium since 2018, so this is really going to be a first for all of us. And, Ohio State, they might have been caught looking ahead last weekend just a little bit. Maryland kind of gave them, more than a scare. It was a 3-point game well into the fourth quarter, and, Ohio State kind of escaped College Park with that 43-30 victory. But you look at that, and for Ohio State, it's just a huge sigh of relief because, this game has been marked on their calendar since last season. Ever since that 42-27 loss in Michigan Stadium, they've had this game marked on their calendar for a while. And Jacob, you got to go to the press conference today. You got to hear from Ryan Day and whatnot. Just what have you been hearing leading up to, this monumental matchup?
Yeah, absolutely. Another fun press conference with Ryan Day. A bit more of a serious demeanor from him, I thought. Usually he takes the first question and there's a little bit of a smile and a little bit of a facial reaction, but he was all business today. Kind of follows the mantra that he's had all season regarding the game. But, you mentioned how last week Ohio State and Maryland really battled there towards the end. 33 combined points there in the fourth quarter. Ohio State wins by 13, but really had a 3-point lead going down into, crunch time there. But as you mentioned, Ohio State traveled to Maryland for the first time in 2018, which was also the last time Ohio State played Michigan in Columbus, so a couple of connections there. And really, Ohio State looked like it needed to play a full fourth quarter game, in which it did, in order to put away Maryland. But now you look ahead to this weekend's game, and you mentioned it's the first time in Columbus since 2018. It's also Ryan Day's first time coaching in the game as head coach in Columbus. So I think, as you mentioned, all the chips are in for this one. Both teams coming undefeated, obvious playoff implications with this one. And Ryan Day, Jim Knowles, and a good number of Buckeyes, including Paris Johnson Jr., Tommy Eichenberg, who's playing with, which could be close to 2 broken hands. And he says they feel good, but Tommy Eichenberg is an interesting player. So, but nonetheless, Ohio State's going to need everyone this weekend against Michigan. All the chips are in, and I'm more than ready for it.
Yeah, you talk about needing all the players. Not only is Tommy Eichenberg banged up, Lathan Ransom played with a broken thumb last week against Maryland, but also the running back depth as well. Travion Henderson returned after missing a pair of games, and he caught that touchdown pass early, and he just did not look right. he was limping off the field and was running in place on the sidelines. And, I mean, Ohio State's backfield is banged up. There was a photo I saw the other day of Mayan Williams at practice, and it was funny. Some of the replies to that tweet were like, show a full body pic of Mayan. Full body pic. And that's just because, I mean, he's been dealing with some lower leg issues after dealing with that hand issue, getting caught up with the chains at Penn State. He had to be helped off the field at home against Indiana. So the Buckeyes' backfield has been banged up as well. And that's not to mention Michigan's backfield. They're dealing with injuries themselves. Blake Corum left last week's matchup against Illinois. I believe he took like a helmet to the knee. So, I mean, that doesn't feel good in the slightest, you know. I mean, and then Donovan Edwards missed last week. So, I mean, you can see the third-string running back on both sides, which, I mean, would be a fairly even matchup if you ask me. But, I mean, hey, that's left to be seen.
Well, looking at Ohio State and Michigan, you can take your pick and basically play operation at this point. With as many injuries are going to be on both of these rosters, you know, not even counting, you know, the hammy of Jackson Smith and Jigba. Emeka Egbuka has not been 100%. You know, there have been different guys with injuries that are not just the foot, the leg, you know, Corum with what he has, you know, the hand of Mayan Williams. But what you said about, you know, Dallin Hayden and the third strings potentially being the go-to guys this Saturday is, I believe Ryan Day said, whatever, he said something along the lines of, we'll have to evaluate, you know, is an 100% available and ready Dallin Hayden versus Travion Henderson or Mayan Williams at 70 or 80%. If they're not at 100%, you know, he's going to have to strategically pick who's going to be in the game on certain downs and doing what. So that's just something to look for because, you know, you might have somebody who isn't 100% and then one play, if they get hit right, they could be done for the entirety of the rest of the game.
And something I noticed during the Maryland game is, I'm not sure if this was intentional, but Ohio State's defensive backs were playing, you know, far off the line of scrimmage, and that allowed Talia Tagovailoa to kind of almost, in a sense, outplay C.J. Stroud. You know, if you look strictly at the box score, you know, in my opinion, you know, the two quarterbacks were having a nice duel because Stroud was, you know, making some throws that Tagovailoa wasn't even attempting. But at the same time, you know, Tagovailoa was just giving what the defense showed him, and it was effective especially down the stretch when, you know, he was able to run in for a touchdown, and then later, you know, got the game within 3, and then, you know, like Jacob said, almost down to the wire. It was a 3-point game. You know, 13 points is kind of misleading due to that, you know, last-second defensive touchdown.
Right, and I mean, they had a chance to win it there at the end as well. They could have drove down and won the game, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, with Michigan, it kind of feels like a different beast than what Ohio State's been used to with the Wolverines over the past 9 years. After they, you know, Jim Harbaugh finally got the monkey off his back by beating Ohio State. And this is the first time under Jim Harbaugh that the Wolverines are 11-0. So they're coming in extremely prepared, and they're coming in, you know, with the mindset instead of, it seems like, you know, oh man, like I hope we're able to beat Ohio State. Instead this year it's, we are able to beat Ohio State. Let's just see if we're able to do it.
Well, and you talk about, you know, the Wolverines. The Wolverines are coming in with the confidence of, we won it in our place. Let's win it on the road. And then, you know, the rivalry kind of shifts. You know, Michigan still historically has the edge all time. Wins in this rivalry, conference titles in the Big Ten. I believe it's 43-39 in that category. So, you know, Michigan with this win will basically have the driver's seat in that Big Ten championship game. So they would be able to add another tally there, where Ohio State in the last, you know, decade or two has been catching them, not only in just head-to-head battles.
Right, and I mean, Stephen, going back to the point that you brought up about Ohio State playing the soft coverage, they were giving up some of the tight end screens. Maryland was running some misdirection and some throwbacks. That seems very Michigan-like because, I mean, they line up in those rugby-style jumbo-type packages. Doesn't that kind of have a feel of, like, something that they could run on offense, Jacob? Just, like, you know, they ground and pound the entire game, and then they just slip a little tight end screen. A little throwback goes for 10, 15 yards, and that's sort of the thing that does it, you know?
Yeah, I remember from last year, obviously with some of the weather conditions and just the way Ohio State's defensive scheme last year, it allowed Michigan to obviously just pound the football up the line of scrimmage and through Ohio State's defense and eventually finding the end zone. And so any way that Michigan can get creative, it might not surprise me, not even in the slightest, just because of the stakes, particularly with this game compared to last year.
Right, and I mean, it's kind of ironic we're talking about Michigan's pass game because coming in, the whole mantra was, will Ohio State's rush defense be able to stop Michigan, But now with Blake Corum out, Donovan Edwards, believe it or not, I had to look up the third-string running back for Michigan, C.J. Stokes, so we could have a freshman running back duel on Saturday of neither the first neither the first string nor the second string for both sides are able to go. I'd kind of give my slight edge to Dallin Hayden because C.J. Stokes on the year, he only has, let's see here, C.J. Stokes only has 53 carries, and he has 281 yards. Dallin Hayden already has over 500 yards this year. Touchdowns, Dallin Hayden has 5 to his 1. So, I mean, he tripled him up last week alone, and he had 3 against Maryland. So, I mean, edge Ohio State if the running back situation is doomed for the worst for both sides.
And I think the game against Maryland was kind of indicative of how much Ryan Day trusts his running back room because, you lose Travion Henderson, you don't have Mayan Williams, and you lost Evan prior to the beginning of the year. You're down to basically just Hayden, and he trusted Hayden in those tight situations. Hayden has the most carries of any Ohio State running back this year at 27, and it came against Maryland. So I don't think Ryan Day is afraid to trust Dallin Hayden in any way, shape, and form. I just think that potentially he wants to get that air game going because, like you said in your call out, Casey, this is kind of like C.J. Stroud's Heisman game. If he wants to win that Heisman Trophy, this is the game to show out, throw 6 touchdowns, and have that Heisman performance that he's been looking for all year.
But, I mean, very quickly, because I saw Gabe, I saw you wanted to go. I cut you off right there. Looking at the weather report, very interesting. It's 52 degrees. Rain chances have increased, 71% during the day and 87% at night, with winds 10 to 15 miles an hour. So not near the northwestern weather monsoon conditions we saw, but something potentially to affect things,
Well, and I'm glad you talked about Northwestern because we've seen in the past game defensively for Ohio State, what have they struggled to do in the past game? It's defend the short and intermediate routes. Northwestern had a little bit of success when they were throwing the ball. They were throwing screens. They were throwing things not down the field. Maryland thrived on the same kind of thing in chunk plays, but if Michigan's going to win this game, it's going to be by eating ground. And that, in essence, is, Ohio State's given up big plays, but they can't afford to give up 5 or 6 on first down in a pass sense. Like you said, they've been playing off a bit, and especially we've been talking about Ryan Day trusting his running backs. Jim Harbaugh, it'll be interesting to see what kind of game he calls in terms of trusting J.J. McCarthy, who's become a little bit less, he's had a decrease in completions, and it's been tougher sledding as the year's gone on for that Michigan offense.
And the thing that's interesting is how Ohio State will defend the quarterback run. Because, I mean, that's another element that you have to sort of account for, especially with these potential conditions.
Absolutely.
And the thing about it is can they do it? I mean, it's simple as that. I mean, it's not rocket science.
But it is. But it is on a. If you're trying to not only stop the rushing game at the line of scrimmage against a good offensive line, you're trying to keep from giving up the big play in the second half. Keep your safeties deep enough and your DBs in position to cover open receivers and play action, and also have a QB spy or guys who can get there, like Tommy Eichenberg, who can just roam the field and make a play when they're gonna. They might have some plays they have to make to win this game, and if they don't make them, they will lose. So there's a possibility that, we haven't seen very many busts in this secondary and in this defense in general, but we've seen some evidence that could happen.
And, I mean, the thing about, in a weird way, can't J.J. McCarthy just kind of heave it up there for Ronnie Bell? Sort of like the meme, Jamar's down there somewhere.
No. That's what
Why
I'm
not?
saying is because
no, hear me out. The corners have not stepped up. I mean, Cam Brown had that nice play last week, but you saw Jordan Hancock get burned. I remember a third down, Denzel Burke played soft coverage. They were able to pick it up. So could that be a little bit of a facet to kind of take Ohio State off the run game?
I mean, honestly, that's going to be a facet. You're correct. But the problem in this game is if Stroud is able to throw the ball, where weather looks like it's going to be rainy and, 10 to 15 mile per hour winds, you can throw the ball in that weather. And if anybody can throw the ball in that weather, it's C.J. Stroud.
But will the receivers catch it?
Good question, but it's kind of a tale of two programs in their quarterback and their trust in them right now, right? Do you trust McCarthy to pinpoint the ball all the way down the field in those conditions, even though he might have wide receivers who can make the catch,
right?
Versus Stroud putting it on receivers who haven't caught everything that's come their way.
Right, it's a good point because even thinking back to late in that Illinois game. He couldn't.
The tight end?
He couldn't even hit the tight end in the flat.
And he had green grass back.
Back
to Columbus. They could have started coming down early. So it's interesting to see because especially if you have to compete with an Ohio State team that is churning out touchdown drives. To stay in the game, you have to score touchdowns and you have to kind of thread the needle.
Oddly enough, Steven, do you think more of the worry lies with Ohio State's offense than their defense?
Well, I think that Ohio State's offense needs to be wary of said ground game because Ohio State is facing a Michigan rush defense that's second in the FBS in average yards per game given up. They only give up 79.5 rushing yards per game. And so Ohio State is going to need to find a way to Dallin Hayden's going to, if he does start the game, he's going to need to find ways to, slip through the holes that the offensive line is able to provide in, if at all, because, Michigan's run defense in their front seven is very good and very stout.
Dude, I saw a quote that was Mazzie Smith is he's like a fridge with legs or something. I saw he's a fridge that can
Bro
move.
is talking about Twitter memes.
Yeah, no, it's
new
funny.
Segment? Question mark?
No, it's funny because, with now the potential injury to Matt Jones as well, who steps in? Josh Fryer, Enoch Mahi. Dallin Hayden showed the vision, but every good running back comes behind a great offensive line. So if Ohio State can't get that push at the line of scrimmage, it might be tough sledding, and Ohio State might become one-dimensional, which didn't really hurt them last year when C.J. Stroud went for just under 400 yards. Last year, the tail of the tape was Hassan Haskins on the ground for 5 touchdowns.
And I wanted to talk about real quick, just kind of an X factor. You mentioned the Illinois game, Casey. Remember who won that game for Michigan? It wasn't anybody on offense. It was Jake Moody. Without Jake Moody hitting that field goal,
True.
Michigan doesn't win that game. And he's not in my opinion, he's probably the best kicker in the NCAA right now. Leads the NCAA in points at 122, and he averages over 2 field goals per game. And so you mentioned these bad weather conditions. If Michigan isn't able to find the end zone, and the same for Ohio State, it honestly could come down to a battle of the special teams. And in that instance, I kind of have to give the edge to Michigan.
I agree because Noah Ruggles has missed at times. Jake Moody has proven he hasn't.
I agree with Steven. You don't want this game coming down to a Jake Moody field goal. If that's the way that this game goes and Michigan has a chance to win it, he's probably splitting those uprights and a lot of Ohio State fans
another.
I don't know, man. He might, depending on what that crowd does, he might just be all in the moment because that
is
would
he going to give him the Marcus Hall double bird?
That was the first image that came to mind. He's
Michigan
not
State's
like
kicker
6'7" like that though. So I don't know if he'd escape. But it is interesting when you talk about field position, especially when the Buckeyes. What's really got them going from time to time is the play of those guys getting the ball and winning the field position battle. This is a game where that might be an emphasis for Michigan. And if Ohio State is consistently starting drives inside its own 15, at the 7, inside the 10, where, Stroud has made some decisions that weren't great, he hasn't really turned the ball over that much recently, but he's made some decisions and thrown some passes that, only one guy can get, and unfortunately he hasn't been able to get to it.
The one that comes to mind is that throw where it went through the Maryland defender's hands and just right through the hands of Emeka Egbuka as well. That was, as Pro Football Focus would say, a turnover-worthy play.
Well, and what I think, I also saw the throw down the right sideline, right at the end zone to Marvin Harrison Jr. that was called an interception that nobody could catch.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like,
that's got to end up in row 5.
Yes, you want to give your receivers a chance, but in a game like this where every possession matters so much, there's only 60 minutes of clock.
Agreed.
You can't afford to give a team that can salt away potentially 7 to 8 minutes on one drive.
I agree.
That much, free real estate, some would say.
And one thing Ryan Day has talked about all season has been taking care of the ball. And one thing that Michigan doesn't have this season is an Aiden Hutchinson-type player there on the defensive line, a Heisman that can bowl over an offensive lineman like he did last season. And so you talk about field positioning, both, Jesse Mirko and the special teams for Ohio State. He's been nominated for some of the postseason awards just for his punting abilities there. But, in my notes, I have my players to watch from Ohio State being Marvin Harrison Jr. and C.J. Stroud. And you just take a look back at Marvin's last couple of games.
I mean, that's an interesting combo. How'd you come up with that, Jacob?
It's Ohio State's arguably best duo, and it's when Ohio State needs its best duo to step up. Marvin has only had one touchdown caught in the last 4 games. He hasn't had a stretch like that all season, honestly.
And that was against Indiana, correct?
And that came against Indiana, indeed, his most recent 100-yard receiving game. So 2 of his last 3 games, both Northwestern and Maryland, perhaps teams you don't quite expect to, lock down a number 1 receiver like Marvin Harrison Jr., especially in an offense such as Ohio State's. But if Ohio State can maybe get Marvin Harrison back in the end zone more recently or more frequently rather, that's going to obviously spur some offensive firepower. But you also brought up a name earlier, Gabe, that slipped my mind, so how many other minds is it slipping? Jackson Smith-Njigba. There was no update given on him from Ohio State's weekly press conference. No question, no mention, and so that is pretty interesting to me. There was no update, and so what's Ohio State going to have to say later on in the week? Are they going to put out anything, or are we just going to see come game time what JSN and his health status is looking like?
Well, it is interesting because it's just another weapon you can pull out of your bag and add to whatever your artillery is. But I would not bank on JSN playing this week. Now, it would be interesting if he suddenly, showed up, helmet in hand, ready to go on the sidelines, was just out there to start the game. But they've already got their guy, Weapon X, I thought. Mr. Johnson over there, who's been crucial in helping them, as, like you said, Marvin Harrison Jr. has seen less work in the receiving category. Now, it will be interesting to see, because we haven't really talked a lot about Michigan's defense in the secondary, but it'll be interesting to see where they shade, whether it's a lot of zone or man, or whether they're, in 2 high looks, whether they've got Marvin Harrison in their sights at all times with somebody shadowing over the top to make sure they don't get burnt for one of those touchdowns. Because if that's the case, and as he's seen decreased work in these last couple weeks and repetitions, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of game both of these coaches call because, the bubble screens have and haven't worked at times. Some of the throwbacks to guys such as Cade Stover. I'm looking to see how involved, those secondary wide receivers are because, if JSN does not play, that does not mean you don't have the best players out there. But, I'm looking for big things from Emeka had a good game against Maryland. Stover has become a great receiving baby Gronk, farmer Gronk in the middle of that field. And he's pretty mobile, too. That's the thing. A lot of these guys are mobile and can catch the ball and can run the ball. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some, 2 guys in the backfield, maybe 1 running back, 1 wide receiver, besides C.J. Stroud in the shotgun to see whether we really get crazy in these schemes and formations.
And it's really going to be like, two sides of the same coin with this matchup because Ohio State, they love to air it out. Michigan loves to kill you on the ground. And then, on the flip side, Ohio State has the number 1 scoring offense. They're either tied for number 1 or barely just behind Tennessee. But Michigan has the best scoring defense. You know how many points they're giving up per game? 11.7. That is less than 2 touchdowns,
Okay,
without
what's
the
their
extra
outlier,
point.
though? Because Penn State had what, 14? Did they score in the second half?
I believe they had 17. I believe it was 41-17.
Oh, shiver me timbers. The thing there for me is they really haven't played any offenses the caliber of Ohio State. And if you look at Penn State, right? Penn State played at home. And where you play those games dramatically changes how the outcome comes about. So, Michigan really locking in the second half there, that speaks more to me about their defense as a whole, like you said. But I think it's kind of it's an apples to oranges in how Ohio State faced Penn State, especially since Ohio State was down. And that game was a low-scoring game until the fourth quarter.
Well, you mentioned how, Michigan's defense hasn't really faced an offense like Ohio State's. I counter with the inverse of that, where Ohio State hasn't faced a defense like Michigan's. You can argue that, Penn State is. We could argue that.
Iowa, though.
Well, yeah, you could argue Iowa, but remember that they still put up almost 400 yards, and that was probably one of their worst offensive performances of the year. But you got to remember that Iowa's defense and Michigan's defense may be similar, but their offenses certainly are not.
Absolutely, and that's what I'm saying is both these teams haven't seen complete teams on both sides of the ball to the level that they're gonna face this Saturday in this heavyweight battle. This is gonna be a slugger, a shot-for-shot kind of, opportunity for both teams to really cement themselves as the Big Ten potential champion and the victor to emerge, we would assume, to the college football playoff.
So, one thing that's kind of been weighing on my mind, the past few years, there's always been sort of a breakout freshman for Ohio State that kind of flies under the radar until that Michigan game. I feel like it's not fair to say Dallin Hayden can do that because we've already seen what he can do. I'm looking at guys potentially like C.J. Hicks, Jair Brown, Sonny Styles potentially.
Bro's just naming all of them. That's crazy.
There's way more than that. Caden Curry as well, potentially forcing a fumble on a special teams play. We've seen him on some special teams plays as well. I'm curious who y'all are thinking, who y'all are potentially leaning. Maybe Jair Brown with an interception, Jacob?
Yeah, that's a good pick there. I think Caden Curry along the defensive line. Larry Johnson really likes to rotate those guys. I think we saw him earlier this season, step up and help block a punt earlier on. So he's someone that's really and honestly broken out a little bit more than I think Ohio State expected, but he really was their leading defensive line recruit coming in the last cycle.
Steven?
I don't see. Here's the thing. So I didn't really pay much attention to the game growing up until I got to Ohio State. So I've never really noticed during those games who was kind of the guy to step up. But I saw Gabe react when his name was called. So I'll say C.J. Hicks. I think C.J. Hicks is a fantastic player. And Gabe, you had a startling you just had a startling reaction. What was that about?
I love that pick, Steven. But if Tommy Eichenberg is playing with what we think he might be playing with, potentially 2 broken hands, I don't think C.J. Hicks is seeing the field unless this thing is a massive blowout, which, it could be. But this game, really, outside the 62-39 Ohio State victory, has not been. But I don't think any freshman is really going to be playing in this game. I think Jim Knowles is going to buckle down with the guys he's got on defense. Ryan Day is going to do the same on offense. You go with the horses that got you here, and you win with what you've got working.
Okay, so on that front, who's going to be your breakout player?
My breakout player? I think this is a huge game. It's very easy to say to pick a. I don't think anybody's breaking out. I think everybody on these defenses and offenses have shown what they could do. If JTT didn't have the Penn State game, I think the defensive line is in for a massive game. They didn't get a ton of pressure last week outside of the last drive where they had 2 sacks. One of them popped the fumble up into the air and down into the arms of Steel Chambers for a touchdown. I think it would be interesting to see, if one of those guys on special teams can make a play, because that's where they're going to get somebody. Typically these games, going back and looking through highlights and the big plays and what happened, typically there's a muffed punt or 2. there's a little bit where, emotions are high, you got the adrenaline going. But with that being said, if I had to bet, it would be C.J. Hicks because, of the broken thumb of Lathan Ransom and the potentially broken hands of Tommy Eichenberg.
So Casey asked Gabe about, just a breakout player in general. And I was originally going to say Zach Harrison, but I think Zach Harrison's gotten his flowers recently. Yeah, exactly. I was about to say, I think he's been here for a while. I think he's finally getting the recognition he deserves as, not just an elite run stopper, but also like a guy who can pressure the quarterback. So I'll go the other side of that defensive line. So I'm looking here at the game notes, and the most tackles for loss for an Ohio State player in the game, Vernon Golson had 4 in 2007. He had 3 sacks that game. I think it won't be JT Tuimoloau or Zach Harrison getting the sack. I think it'll be Jack Sawyer.
Another guy I thought of, and I was like, maybe I shouldn't have just taken Stevens because Jack Sawyer really,
This guy's copying my whole flow.
But like he seems to be getting up into the backfield, right?
Absolutely. I mean, he's been pressuring the quarterback at a much higher rate than we saw, during his first year. And that makes sense given, playing in the trenches, especially making the transition from high school to college and then, from college to the NFL is probably the hardest transition you can make. But Jack Sawyer's really come to his own alongside the entire defensive line, and I think that he might be the player to watch for the entire Ohio State team.
The native Columbus Buckeye is Stevens' player to watch going into the game. And I think it's going to be important because obviously we all know Michigan's going to want to establish the run against Ohio State's defense. And Michigan has ran for at least 165 yards in every single game, all 11 of them. Ohio State has only allowed that many twice. That is going to be a big factor to watch on Saturday. How does Michigan establish the run game? Who steps up there on Ohio State's defensive line? Because Ohio State's going to need its best defensive performance to date. Because I know you guys were talking about, Ohio State's facing a defense offensively that it hasn't all season, and you argued maybe Iowa, Penn State, etc. I still think Michigan's going to be the best defense, offense, best team because it's going to get up for this rivalry game. Iowa is not going to play Ohio State like Michigan is against Ohio State, especially with the spirited rivalry. And honestly, the rivalry I think might be at a turning point. Ohio State could win and avenge its loss from the 2021 season, or Michigan could win back-to-back games for the first time in quite some time, and Ohio State's going to have to really ask itself some hard questions, harder than last season, and in which that it resulted in a new defensive coordinator, new offensive line coach, some other changes, but the rivalry's at a bit of an inroads, and Ohio Stadium would be the site of its next championship round.
And you talk about potential coaching changes. I think if Ryan Day loses this year, he's on the hot seat. And sort of the mantra in Columbus is if you lose 3 times in a row, you're out. So that would sort of be, he's in dire straits if he loses this year.
So you would consider, Ryan Day, this could be his second to last rivalry game.
Potentially. That's operating quite like often entirely hypothetical situation. But, if Ohio State wins, all that's out the window. The clock resets because there's no denying Ryan Day's success and his winning ways in his 4 years here.
All right, so, this Saturday, all the talk about hypotheticals and what ifs and, waiting for this is finally here. The game Saturday, I believe at noon. Big Noon will be there. College Game Day will be there. It's going to be an absolutely electric atmosphere at Ohio Stadium. And this is going to be our last regular season prediction of the year. Isn't that crazy? We didn't really do one last week, but unofficially, Gabe Burggraf is in the lead. Just to point that out. But
just to point it out.
But looking at this game, Ohio State favored by 7.5, and I don't think that it's going to be that big. I think this game really comes down to one possession, and I don't think it's a touchdown. And part of me really, really wants to pick Michigan to win this game, but I think Ohio State finds a way to win this game 35-31.
Oh, you're making me go so that you can figure out what I'm betting and go against it.
No.
So that you guys can eventually catch up. It's all right. I like what you say, Steven. Vegas must know something because the disparity between, Ohio State's offense when it's fully functional, that Death Star of destruction that it is compared to Michigan, coming in potentially not at full force. Questions about Blake Corum, questions about whether they can throw the ball down the field and stretch the Buckeyes vertically and laterally. 7.5 is not a lot of points. That is, you got to win by 2 scores outside an 8-point win. But depending on the rain and depending on the circumstance, I was tempted to take Michigan in this spot, but I think Ohio State's offense is But we did this last year where Ohio State's offense was supposed to be good enough to win them this game against Michigan on the road. And then they, as much as the defense couldn't get stops, the offense only scored 27 points. So, you had less possessions, but you scored less than 30. I think...
Go with your gut, man.
Based on the history, Michigan has not won a game in Ohio Stadium in my lifetime. Last time they did was just under a month before I was born. I think the Buckeyes win this game 30-28.
I like that.
On a Ruggles field goal as time expires.
The stakes have increased.
We've been waiting on this one since our freshman year.
We sure have, man. We sure have.
You're talking about your score prediction, right? Because that's what I've been waiting for mine since my freshman year.
I'm probably not the only one. Yeah, I remember coming into the Lantern newsroom and as a freshman seeing all of the rest of the first-year student journalists, and a lot of us were already looking ahead to the game in 2022, talking about how it would be potentially the last home game we cover as student journalists at Ohio State. And here we are. I'm with Gabe. I see this game going right down to the wire. I see a Rose Bowl type game. All the chips are in for this game. All the stakes are on the line. It just makes too much sense. It's going to be a movie on Saturday. That's what I asked Ryan Day earlier this week was, it's the undergraduate student body at Ohio State hasn't seen the game in Columbus as a student in 4 years. And, he talked about how remarkable that was. And, in fact, it's gone longer than his time as a head coach at Ohio State. And so it's all going to come down to the wire there on Saturday, and I see the score doing the same as well. I believe a few weeks ago earlier on this podcast, I said Ohio State would hang 100 on Michigan, and this season would be the only time it would be justifiably so. And I'm still behind that. I still think Ohio State is going to try and run up the score as much as it can. And I'll give you 2 score predictions for the Price of One podcast. If Ohio State were to hang 100, the score prediction I've got is 102-28. If Ryan Day reportedly, supposedly, and, rumor mill said he would hang 100 back in the 2020 season, let's see if Ohio State can possibly do it. If we're being a little bit more realistic, like I mentioned, I do see this game being a Rose Bowl type going right down to the wire. My score prediction is 42-39. And that's not to say that the difference between the two teams is only 3 points, because it might be wider, it might be less so. But the game on Saturday will come down to a 3-point score. Gabe's already called the walk-off field goal. I think Ohio State might just have to force a turnover on downs and maybe not get so much of a storybook ending, but we'll probably see a storybook moment. How about Marvin Harrison, 4 touchdowns?
It's been interesting looking over the past 10 years. Let me read off these scores for you. 40-34 loss for Ohio State, 26-21 win, 42-41 win, 42-21 win, 42-13 win, 30-27 win in overtime, 31-20 win, 62-39 win, 56-27 win, and the infamous 42-27 loss that we've been getting in our TikTok comments for the past year. It's been so funny. It's been so funny saying that. So the number I see, Jacob already said it, 42 is very interesting. I'm looking at an analytics report right here, and it says the projected score is 30-25, So looking at the numbers very analytically, because I'm a forward thinker, I'm not a dinosaur age brain like y'all, just looking at passing and rushing yards per game. Ohio State's expected points margin.
Expected points is crazy. You either know ball or you don't, bro.
Dinosaur brain, like I said. Forward thinker over here. Expected points margin for Ohio State, .234. that's first in the country. So they're outscoring their opponents by a higher margin per play in the country. You know who's number 2? Michigan. What are they at? .182. So that's a significant drop-off. That's about half a point per play that Ohio State's scoring more on both sides of the ball. And so that comes down to it. If you put that over the course of a game, that's kind of where you get to 7.5. I think that's fair. Not today, sweetheart. Lee Corso is going to be in town, so not so fast, sweetheart, on that 7.5. Michigan covers, but I think Ohio State wins real close. You know what they win by? 1 point. It's going to be a 35-34 Ohio State win.
And I want to put on the record that our sports editor, Jacob Benge, did not know that the 2006 score was 42-39. That the game of the century, that's crazy. But hopefully we'll see another game of the century this Saturday at the Horseshoe at noon. So that will do it for episode 12 of the Lantern Sports Podcast. For Casey Smith, Jacob Benge, and Gabe Burggraf, I'm Stephen Kishpaugh, and we'll see you in the next episode.